Welcome to Madlik. My name is Jeffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. As we approach the high prayer season, we trace the evolution of one of the oldest prayers preserved in the Torah, the Bikurim, or First Fruits Declaration, made by a farmer on Shavuot, the Harvest Festival. We explore how this prayer was censored, repurposed, and reinterpreted, and wonder what license it provides to us. So grab a bowl of fruit and a siddur and join us for First Fruits, First Prayers. Well, welcome back. Another week. And as we said in the pre-show, the high holidays are coming. They're coming. They're coming. They're not waiting for us. And that's what I meant when I referred to the prayer season, because isn't that actually what it is? I mean, there's no time of year that we pray more, that we are engaged with our liturgy. And before we get to the exact text from our parsha that I want to discuss, and the parsha is Ki Tavo in Deuteronomy, it just seems to me, Rabbi, that Deuteronomy is the source of many prayers, much of our liturgy. I mean, the most famous Shema Yisrael is in Deuteronomy 6:4. Last week, while not liturgy, we talked about the paragraph that says that you have to remember what Amalek did to you, and I referenced that there is a whole Shabbat called Shabbat Zachor that we focus just on saying that verse, that little chapter in public. And some say that's one of the rare occasions that literally by Torah law we have to make that declaration. So am I wrong here that there's this little of our liturgy comes from the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses itself, but that does, there's a lot in Deuteronomy.
So you're absolutely right. And, the fact that Shema, not only the paragraph of Shema, but the second paragraph of the Shema, the Hayayim Shamoa, also comes in the book of Deuteronomy. I think the reason is probably a simple reason, and that is Deuteronomy is the kind of the summary, the review of the Torah. So it has paragraphs that have a lot of different ideas all together. Like in the paragraph of Shema, you have belief in God, you have study Torah, you have tefillin, you have mezuzah, you have, all these things. You have reward and punishment. It's all there in one paragraph. You don't have that in the rest of the Torah. So actually, in terms of prayers and in terms of kind of covering all the bases, Deuteronomy is a great place to get prayers from.
And, I would kind of add, and I've said this before, that, modern scholarship believes that Deuteronomy was probably written closer to when Ezra came back from the exile. We're talking about a period where there was maybe no temple anymore. The synagogues were starting to be formed. But even if you don't take higher criticism, you don't buy into that message, the whole angst of Deuteronomy is when you come into the land. And certainly coming into the land, the central Mishkan was over, and there were this beginning of what we could see decentralized Judaism, and certainly it had a prophetic sense of there would be a time where Jews would need to pray and our religion would change. So I think from all different perspectives, there's no question that Deuteronomy is a great source for later liturgy. I think we're on the same page there.
Good. I think that's 100% right. And I think, that just makes the point stronger. But, whatever the explanation is, just making the point is interesting, right? Just realizing that so much of our prayer service and the Shema itself comes from Deuteronomy is a super interesting point.
Great. So here we are. We're going to start with, as I said in the introduction, one of the most iconic little prayers, declarations, if you will. Certainly something that we'll see ended up in our liturgy by way of the Haggadah. It is a farmer's declaration of bringing the first fruits of the harvest to the temple, and it starts in Deuteronomy 26:3. It says, "You shall go to the priest in charge at that time and say to him, I acknowledge this day before your God that I have entered the land that God swore to our fathers to assign us. The priest shall take the basket from your hand and set it down in the front of the altar of your God. You shall then recite as follows before your God. My father was a fugitive Aramean. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. If this sounds familiar to any of us, it's because it is quoted in the Haggadah. And what the Haggadah does is literally take every one of the words that I just said when it says the Egyptians dealt harshly with us, when it says that we became a goy gadol atzum v'rav, when it says they oppressed us, v'anuhu, it has a standing commentary which actually becomes the most fundamental core part of the whole Haggadah Seder moment. And it says, we cried to God, the God of our ancestors, and God heard our plea. God heard our plea. You'll see in the Passover Haggadah, it says when God heard our plea, he understood what they were doing to us. Maybe he was separating men from women. It goes into this running commentary in the Haggadah. He saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. God freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand. You remember in the Haggadah, it talks about what does it mean by biyad chazakah, by an outstretched arm, Zroa Nituya, and awesome powers, and by signs and portents, bringing us. So, this is as far as the Haggadah goes, but the literary piece, the parsha of Bikurim continues, bringing us to this place, El Hamakom Hazeh, and giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of soil which you, God, have given me. You shall leave it before your God and bow low before your God, and you shall enjoy together with the Levite and the stranger in your midst, and all the bounty that your God has bestowed upon you and your household. And then if you were looking at this text in a Sefer Torah, there is an end of literary piece, the end of Parshat Bikurim. We're finished. So this clearly is a very old piece. It is, in a sense, quoted. You're literally quoting what the farmer says in front of the Kohan. So, Rabbi, how many prayers like this do we have that are verbatim, and what does it mean to you?
Well, you said a mouthful here. The first interesting thing is that this is probably the earliest prayer that we have, which means that this was said as a prayer in the time of the Torah. When they brought the first fruits, they recited this as a prayer. We just a minute ago talked about Shema. Now, Shema in the Torah is not written as a prayer, meaning that Moshe tells the people to believe in God and to put on tefillin and to put up a mezuzah, but he doesn't say recite this every day. It wasn't a prayer. We took it to become a prayer. But this is actually was a prayer. And that's really interesting. It's interesting because what you see is that we have prayers. From the very beginning of time, we have prayers. There are very few prayers in the Torah. There's another example of a prayer when Miriam, Moshe's sister, is sick. So Moshe says to God, Kelna Rifana La. God, please cure her. It's the shortest prayer in history. But that's an example of a prayer. And here we have another prayer. So it's interesting that the Torah recognizes the value of prayers and even gives us some prayers that we're actually reciting.
You know, you saying that reminds me of the key prayers of the high holidays. Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun. This is something we're going to start saying Slichot on Saturday night. These prayers are not only old, but because they're old, they almost seem to have power, don't they? And if you really can count on your fingers whether they're prayers like this one, or whether like the Shema, we're quoting verses. I mean, some of the other ones that come to mind is with Bilam, Ma Tovu or Halecha. You start our service every day with that. We quote, "How goodly are the tents of Jacob." It's maybe written over the ark. We have the prayer that maybe parents say on their children on Friday night, Yesimcha Elohim Kefraim U'Komanasha, which is what Joseph said. But you're absolutely right. This is, along with Rafan Allah, which is with Miriam, is one of the few places where, at least in the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, you have actually texts of prayers.
Yeah, that is interesting. In the history of prayer, that's interesting that prayer is biblical. That's not the prayers we say. The prayers we say are basically rabbinic. The Amidah that we recite is not found in the Torah. The Amidah that we recite, the rabbis made up. So we generally think of prayer as being rabbinic. But the truth is that prayer is biblical. There is a biblical source for prayer.
I mean, I think if you look at, for instance, the Shemona Esrei, the 18 benedictions, the Amidah, the silent prayer, a lot of stuff is taken from Psalms. Psalms is a rich source of, if not prayers, but at least phrases or ways of talking about healing people or making them stand up straight or reviving them in the morning. But here, actually, it's very few times that in our liturgy we have stuff directly from the 5 books of Moses, but there are a few cases, and this is a very, very old prayer, no question about it.
Right. So that's the beginning of what's interesting here. Now, the text of the prayer is also interesting because what the prayer is it's kind of a review of Jewish history to allow us to be grateful to God, recognizing not only that God gave us new fruits, but that God gave us everything, beginning with taking us out of Egypt.
I mean, isn't it amazing if you step back for a second, and the 2 prayers that we've identified as biblical and old, one had to do with healing, and the other one had to do with thanks. And how, what more can you talk about thanks than the harvest? I think of he who sows in tears reaps in joy. Hasorim b'dima barina yiktsaru. There's nothing more primal than the thankfulness, and it comes all the way to the Puritans and the Thanksgiving festival and Sukkot that we're going to have. You can almost track the 3 major festivals, the pilgrimage festivals, all around agriculture, which ultimately becomes that we are dependent on the earth, we're dependent on rain, we're dependent on God. And the flip side of that is we are so thankful when we have a basket of fruit that we can bring to God to thank him or her.
Right. I think all that is exactly right. I think that's wonderful here. And then the use of this prayer in the Seder also needs to be discussed. Why do we choose this verse? To make the question better, let me ask it like this. The Seder on Passover remembers the Exodus from Egypt. If we're going to choose verses that talk about the Exodus from Egypt, why don't we take verses from the book of Exodus that talk about the Exodus from Egypt? It seems kind of ridiculous that we choose verses from the book of Deuteronomy that talk about the Exodus from Egypt. We might as well choose the original story. I might as well, if I'm reading the story, I don't know what's the story of the respect that they're paying to the queen. I might as well read it as it's happening now. I'm not interested 10 years from now when they write a book about it. The story in the moment is actually more accurate and more reflective of the way people are thinking. Later on, you kind of just have a perspective. So why do we choose the verses from Devarim, from Deuteronomy, and not the verses from Exodus?
So that is an amazing question. And I think that also will give us an insight into some prayers of the high holidays. So one of the commentaries on the Haggadah that I love, he claims, he says that the Mishnah wanted, and by the way, the Mishnah in Psachim actually dictates that these verses are said. In Psachim 10:4, it says that when teaching his son about the Exodus, he begins with the Jewish people's disgrace and concludes with their glory. Matchilim bignai v'gomrim b'shvach. And he expounds from the passage, an Aramean tried to destroy my father, which is our verse, with a new translation we'll find out in a second. The declaration one recites when presenting his first fruits at the temple, and here the Mishnah says, until he concludes explaining the entire section. So the Mishnah says you have to read it ad sheyigmor kol haparsha kulo. The Mishnah, in fact, says, to answer your question, not why, but that you have to say this whole section about bringing the first fruits in the night of the Seder from beginning to end. But the commentaries in modern scholarship argue that the Mishnah wanted to find a text an integrated commentary that was well known to the Jewish masses. And when we say well known to the Jewish masses, remember, there were many centuries, generations of Jews who did not even speak Hebrew. They spoke Aramaic, they spoke other languages. Because this prayer of giving the Bikurim was so iconic, these scholars argue we picked the one that people knew. They not only knew the words in Hebrew, but they also kind of knew in a sing-song way the commentary on it. So there was a great scholar named David Tzvi Hoffman who wrote a book called The First Mishnah, and he actually uses the Haggadah and the way it goes from Zohar Netuyah and gives an explanation, Biyad Chazakah, and gives an explanation. He says this is a prime example of Midrash Halacha and the earliest use of reading the written law and adding ongoing explanatory Midrash and interpretations. So his answer to your question is there are many other verses that talk about the Exodus of Egypt that might do it in a more poetic way, in a more discursive way, but the rabbis of the Mishnah picked these because, as we started by saying, it was an old prayer that everybody knew. And clearly, this is a prayer, unlike the Shema, that is not household to every Jew nowadays. But there was a time you knew the Bikurim, and that we could talk about.
Well,
that
everybody had first fruits. Everybody had a harvest. We don't live an agricultural life anymore. But if everybody lived an agricultural life, you would all have it.
So again, I think that it's fascinating that when we look at prayers, and some prayers are so well known, and we don't even remember the reason that we know them. I mean, I think, and I'd love your take on this, we come to services on the night of Yom Kippur, the most holiest night of the holiest day of the year, and this service is called after a prayer that we all sing in the same tune, and we probably all get choked up of. It's called Kol Nidre, and it is basically a prayer that has to do with a legal formula for canceling your oaths that you made. And we might not even know the meaning of the words. We might not know the meanings of a lot of words of prayers, but this one has lived way beyond its expiration date, but it still has all the power and the meaning. And that's a fascinating insight, I think, into prayer.
Yeah, that is an interesting point. The power of the prayer, and you raised the power of the tune. The tune of Kol Nidre, exactly what its history is not clear. The key is that everybody has been doing it, right? And everybody sings the same tune, and that's what's so powerful.
Do you know if the Sephardim and the Mizrahim also have the same tune?
I don't know if they have Kol Nidre. I think Kol Nidre is an Ashkenazic thing.
Well, it's certainly for the Ashkenazim, and again, it's a little bit like the beginning of the Seder where we sing the Seder itself. It's like singing the table of contents of a book. You're right; it is the music, but I think the rabbis and the scholars who say that the reason Bikurim was brought into the Haggadah are touching upon this aspect of some of our prayers, that a prayer can be more than the words that are written in it. A prayer can, it becomes like a mantra. It becomes something that we share with each other, and it goes beyond the meaning of the words or the original context. And I think that if we stopped right here, that would be a fascinating lesson about the power of prayer, or how prayer is used, or what its power on us is. Don't you think?
I think that really is a very interesting point. Now, I'll just compare for a minute Kol Nidre and this prayer for the first fruit. This prayer for the first fruit is biblical. Kol Nidre is actually in Aramaic, right? I mean, it's not even in Hebrew. So some of the power is, and Aramaic is like English. That was the language that people spoke. So, sometimes prayer in the vernacular is what's so powerful. And obviously we have that, especially in the more liberal movements, that, prayer in the vernacular has a certain power to it.
Yeah. Yeah, and so there's definitely this issue of language, and those scholars who say that Bikurim was something that people who didn't speak Hebrew and Aramaic was their language still knew because it was so popular. That's one message. And what you said a second ago, which is to walk into a synagogue where most of the services for the rest of the day are going to be in Hebrew, and you see something, you hear something that's in Aramaic, is welcoming. The Kaddish is in Aramaic. So the language is an important part. So I said in the beginning that this was going to be a history of the censorship and the reinterpretation of a prayer. So when I read the verses in Deuteronomy itself, and I said, Arami Oved Avi, the translation was, my father was a fugitive Aramean. Oved is typically translated as someone who is lost, and we'll get a little bit into it for a second. In the Haggadah, however, it introduces, before we get into this first fruits declaration, it says as follows, and those of you who have been at a Seder will remember, V'hishe amda la'avotenu, and this is what stood for our ancestors for us, since it is not only one person that has stood against us to destroy us, but rather each generation they stand against us to destroy us. But the Kadosh Baruch Hu Matzilenu Miadam, God rescues us. So that's the introduction to this prayer of the farmer. And then lo and behold, it changes the meaning. And in the Haggadah it says, an Aramean was destroying my father. Avud, I guess when Esther went in front of, was about to go in front of Achashverosh when she wasn't beckoned, she says, Kasher avadati avadati. Avud definitely can also mean not lost, but lost in the sense of my life is in danger. And the rabbis, in a sense, reinterpreted this whole Parshat Bikurim, this whole declaration of the first fruits, in a different way. Do you agree? Before I ask that question, Rashi, in his interpretation on the Chumash, actually goes out of his way to bring the Haggadah's interpretation. But I think there's a real, if you look at the source sheet, most of the classical commentaries say it's clear that what he was talking about is we were wandering landless people, and here I am, a farmer living in my land, bringing my crop. So how do you account for this change of interpretation?
I mean, that's easy, because they change the interpretation because the new interpretation works out better within the Haggadah.
Especially right? After that introduction. I mean,
right, meaning the simple explanation, which is that we were wandering and now we're in the land of Israel, and now we have our own fruits and all that kind of stuff. That makes a lot of sense given the context of the Chumash. But that's not relevant to the Seder. The Seder wants the big picture, which is that Laban tried to destroy us. Arami Oved Avi, the word avad means from the word try to make us disappear and therefore try to get rid of us.
So I think, and we'll see this comes up in another aspect of what the rabbis did, that there was an evolution in the Haggadah itself. There is the Haggadah that was written and used in the land of Israel, and then when the Jews were exiled, it almost became a Haggadah of the exile. And so the commentary that I have in the source sheet, it's a commentary on, it's called Joseph Tabori. He says as follows. He says, while the temple existed, they understood the whole passage as truly representing their radical change in status. Remember, you're in the land of Israel. You're talking about the exodus from Egypt. You actually parallel that farmer in a very profound way. The people had started out as fugitives or wandering nomads, and now they stood in their permanent home. But he says, after the destruction of the temple, there was no longer any parallelism between the lowly beginnings as nomads and their present status as people saved from persecution. And therefore, they talk about oppression rather than landlessness. So what he is saying, and you can either buy it or not, is that the prayer itself evolved based on the needs of the time. And that when the Mishnah might have said, say these verses of the first fruits, it might have been talking to people that had been, their patriarchs, their ancestors had been in Egypt. Now they were in the land. They were spot on like that farmer. And the Seder was a question of being thankful just like the farmer. But when they were exiled, that message almost missed its mark, and therefore the rabbis put this introduction about how in every generation they come to kill us, and it changed the interpretation of the verse. What do you think of Tabori's theory?
I love that. I love the idea that the interpretation of the verse evolves, and that being grateful to having our own first fruit may not make sense if we don't have our own land. I like that a lot. That's a really good explanation. Thank you.
So that explanation explains something else that I mentioned when I read the verses from our Parsha, which is that in the Haggadah, it quotes from our verses, but it doesn't follow the advice of the Mishnah. It doesn't read it till the end. It stops at verse 9. Verse 9 says, verse 8 says, God freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. You all remember that's where the Haggadah says, what's a mighty hand? By an outstretched arm, by awesome power, by signs and portents. There's at least 2 pages in the Haggadah that talks about each one of these words. But get to verse 9, it says, bringing us to this place, v'yavinu el hamakom hazeh, no interpretation. Giving us this land, no interpretation. A land flowing with milk and honey, no interpretation. All the way till the end, and I've spoken about this before, the last verse it says, and you shall enjoy together with the Levite, the stranger in your midst, all the bounty that God gave you. So in the introduction, I talked about censorship. In a sense, and Tabori goes on to say this, for people that were once more in exile, it would be almost too much to pretend that they weren't. It would be almost too much to talk about coming into the land, a land of milk and honey. And therefore, the Haggadah decided not to quote those verses and not to provide this sing-song commentary about it. And if we step back and we look at prayers, that means that the prayers do evolve based on our condition, where we are. But it's also an open question, and I would say an invitation, is it not?
I think that that's 100% right. I mean, I really like Tabori's explanation. I think it kind of, it also is good for us because what it does is it links the Torah portion to the Haggadah. Usually you think that, the Haggadah just borrows these verses, but they're not really relevant. And what he does is he really connects one to the other. So I like that also.
So at the end of my source sheet, I quote just one section from a whole Google Doc, which comes out of Israel from young scholars in Israel. But literally, there is a revival in the Haggadah today where they continue and they say, "V'yivienu," who brought us in, and they say, then as now as it is said, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to me. In the same kind of tradition, this sing-song thing, they quote another verse. El hamakom hazeh, this place refers to the temple. And it comes from Rabbi David Mishlove, Supplement for Seders in Israel. So here we have an example of a prayer that starts in the 5 books of Moses in Deuteronomy, that was changed, maybe censored out of sensitivity to people living in exile, and is today being rewritten and repositioned for a new generation of Jews who are in the land. And I just find that to be so fascinating.
I think that's great. I think this was really the sources. I give you credit, Jeffrey, because the sources tonight were really, really good.
Well, and I think it's an invitation to all of us as we begin this prayer season, as I call it. There are different ways to approach the prayers. Many of us just focus on what does this prayer mean. But I think tonight we've really seen that there are so many other reflections that can have meaning to us beyond just the simple meaning of the words. And we're going to be in synagogue for so many hours. We need all the tools we can get.
Fantastic. And we still get one more next week. So Shabbat Shalom to everybody, and we'll see you next Thursday. Looking forward. Be well, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you as always, Rabbi. And for any of you who have a comment, Miriam, I'm going to invite you on.
As Sacred Light, I posted something, a little bit commentary that we have another prayer in our Sidurs from the Torah, not from Sefer Dvarim, but from book of the second book of Moses. No, the fourth book of Moses. Sorry,
from Genesis.
Bamidbar.
Oh, Bamidbar.
No, from Bamidbar.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's Yevarecha.
Of course, the Cohen's benediction. That's perfect. We did miss that.
Yeah, and I wanted to add it because I think it's fascinating, although it's not from Sefer Dvarim, but the beautiful part is it's about Kohanim, it's about temple, it's about temple rituals, and it is, and we say it every day morning after Birkat HaTorah.
Yeah.
Do we say that? Yes. Or we say it also a couple other times during the prayers. But this is a beautiful, beautiful prayer.
But and thank you for that. But it is fascinating how few of our prayers come from the Torah itself. The rabbi kind of mentioned that. But those that do obviously have great power. And again, you look at Bikurim, it's a prayer of a farmer being thankful with a historical memory. You look at the priestly blessing that you just mentioned. It doesn't talk about ritual. It talks about that God should bless you and keep you and shine his light upon you and give you peace. I mean, just powerful.
Yes, and what is very interesting that apparently archaeologists in Israel found this prayer on very early materials, and there is this, according to biblical criticism, which we might like or don't like, but they say that this is one of the oldest texts from the five book of Moses. And it's a very, you might like it or not, but it's a beautiful words, and the entire idea of the Hashem should bless you and keep you and turn His face and shine upon you and be graceful into you. There are different translations, and there's so much in this play of words because it's Yehuneka. You can translate it as Hinuk and Hanukkah, and there's just every shoresh, every root here plays so much in this prayer. And again, it's not from first book of Moses; it's from the fourth one. But the observation that you made, I really liked that most of our prayers are from the Sefer Dvarim. That's a fascinating observation, and that there is something very deep about it. Even if I found a little bit prayer here taken from Bamidbar.
So, Miriam, if I remember, you are a graduate. You got smicha from Maharat. Is that correct?
Yes. And Rabbi Means is my teacher.
Yeah, and you serve the Polish community, if I remember correctly. Yes. So,
yes,
what do you do? What do you do what do you do during the high holidays? Are you conducting services or?
No. I am actually and it's kind of public knowledge, so I can tell you I'm struggling right now with cancer. So I am in New York, but I am not able to be in shul in a long, for long periods of time. So I'm undergoing chemo right now. So I'm laying low on the days themselves, but I teach online. Before I'm preparing my class, and I'm actually going. One of the reasons why I want to just teach this material to my students. So that's why I'm so excited. I need that sausage. So I want to teach them in Polish. I'm going to translate parts of what you taught and teach it in Polish. So
amazing. And at this point, you did get the link, right?
Yes.
So anyway, I wish you a life and vibrance and refuah shalema and all those good things that were included in Miriam's Rafan Allah.
Exactly. So actually, Rabbi Means knows about my illness, and it was extremely moving when he actually said it, knowing that I'm in the audience and my name is Miriam. And I love this moment. And it's like, he's my teacher, but it's just like this I was warm and fuzzy when he said this.
As you should have been.
Yeah. It might be just accidental, but I love that type of accidents.
Yeah, there are no accidents, right? Anyway, Shana Tova, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you all for joining us. All the best.
So much.
Thanks, Miriam, for coming on up.
It was fantastic to talk to you, and thank you for all the Torah that you sharing with Rabbi Means. This is beautiful class, and I'm so happy that there is such a spot for Clubhouse to have such a high level Torah on this platform.
Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
All the
Shabbat
best.
Shalom.
Bye bye.
All the best. Bye.